By the spring of 1945, Germany was entirely broken. The absolute devastation of World War II left the nation's infrastructure in ashes and created a massive power vacuum in the heart of Europe. The victorious Allies carved Germany into 4 occupation zones, governed by the US, UK, France, and the Soviet Union. But Germany's capital, Berlin, was 100 miles deep inside the Soviet zone. Yet the Allies divided the city itself into 4 pieces. Over time, the 3 zones controlled by the Western Allies merged to form West Germany, and their slice of the capital became West Berlin, a prosperous capitalist outpost completely encircled by Soviet territory. This cartographic anomaly created a situation where, on a single city street, anyone could walk back and forth between a booming Western economy and a rigid Soviet state. The contrast was immediate. Western investment saw West Berlin flourish with new businesses and open markets, while just blocks away, East Germans lived under strict, impoverished communist rule. Between 1949 and 1961, roughly 3 million people permanently abandoned East Germany. They funneled through the Berlin loophole, simply walking across the city limits. Looking at the demographics, we see a massive brain drain. The fleeing citizens were disproportionately doctors, engineers, and educated youth. This loss of specialized labor removed the exact people needed to run hospitals and maintain infrastructure, threatening East Germany's economic stability. The silent footsteps of 3 million civilians leaving the Soviet bloc forced a global superpower into a corner. To save their economy, they had to physically trap their own workforce. In 1961, East German leader Walter Albrecht secured support from the Soviet Union for a radical decision. He authorized an operation to physically seal off the city's western half from the surrounding east. In the dead of night on August 13th, East German soldiers flooded the streets. Moving with military precision, they rapidly unrolled heavy spools of barbed wire across city intersections. They physically severed the 2 halves of the city, tearing up tram tracks and hammering concrete posts directly into the cobblestones. When citizens awoke the next morning, the shock was total. Families, friendships, jobs, and daily commutes were suddenly cut off by an impenetrable thicket of military-grade wire. By daybreak, the Soviet bloc had successfully walled off its capital, effectively trapping a population of 1 million people within the city limits. The temporary wire quickly gave way to a permanent 155-kilometer-long concrete fortification that looped entirely around West Berlin. The barrier indiscriminately sliced through urban life. Where the border ran directly against residential buildings, authorities bricked up the ground floor doors and windows to prevent residents from jumping into the west. This cross-section diagram reveals the anatomy of the death strip. The concrete was merely the final layer. Escapers first had to clear an inner wall, navigate a massive sand strip wired with landmines, and avoid overlapping fields of fire from watchtowers. But the fortification didn't eliminate the desire for freedom. It simply forced citizens into highly inventive, desperate engineering hacks to beat the system. People spent months secretly digging subterranean tunnels entirely beneath the border guards. Others modified cars to include hidden compartments just large enough to fit a human, or constructed homemade hot air balloons from scraps of fabric. The human cost of these attempts was lethal. Guards had explicit orders to shoot anyone trying to scale the wall, and hundreds lost their lives in the attempt. A regime claiming to build a workers' utopia was now deploying lethal military force for one specific purpose: preventing its own workers from running away. The wall stood for 28 years, freezing the city in a state of tension. But by the late 1980s, the global landscape was changing. The Soviet Union's power was waning under intense economic strain. Across Eastern Europe, a domino effect began. Communist regimes, burdened by decades of economic stagnation and political rot, slowly started buckling under pressure. By 1989, massive civilian protests erupted across East Germany. Citizens took to the streets holding signs like Freie Wahlen, meaning free elections, explicitly demanding democratic rights and freedom of movement. The military force that once froze the population in place was now facing a domestic tide of dissent that the state was no longer equipped to suppress. The pressure finally cracked the state on November 9, 1989. Following massive protests, a bungled government press conference led to a confused, premature announcement broadcasted on live television. The borders were supposedly open immediately. The moment the broadcast aired, thousands of East Berliners rushed the fortified checkpoints in the dark, demanding the guards let them cross. Overwhelmed, outnumbered, and lacking clear orders, the border guards finally yielded. They opened the gates, allowing citizens to walk through and climb atop the barrier that had defined their lives for 3 decades. West Berliners reached down, pulling total strangers over the concrete. Families separated for decades found each other in the crush of the crowd. By morning, ordinary people brought chisels, pickaxes, and sledgehammers, dismantling the dreaded fortification piece by piece with their bare hands. The collapse of the Berlin Wall unified a broken city and dismantled the most visible physical boundary of the Cold War.